For nearly 5 hours, Vladimir Putin sat before cameras, screens, and a carefully curated flow of questions in Russia's annual, direct line, broadcast, a political ritual designed to present power as accessibility, control as calm leadership, and national uncertainty as manageable reality. Officially, it was a question and answer session with ordinary citizens. In practice, it was a performance, tightly staged, strategically framed, and revealing less through what was said than through what was deliberately avoided. This year's broadcast, however, offered several moments that slipped past the polish, giving rare insight into where the Kremlin wants Russia to go next, and what that says about the country's current condition. From the opening minutes, the tone was unmistakable. Putin framed Russia as a nation under pressure but fundamentally stable, resilient, and morally superior to its adversaries. Economic hardship was acknowledged, but only in abstract terms. Inflation, wages, and housing costs were discussed with technical language and promises of gradual improvement. What was absent was any emotional acknowledgement of how deeply these issues affect daily life. The message was clear: difficulties exist, but they are manageable, and more importantly, they are not systemic failures. A central theme of the broadcast was control. Putin repeatedly emphasized that the government is aware of problems and actively managing them. Whether the topic was regional infrastructure, military production, or social services, the answer followed a familiar pattern: identify the issue, blame external pressure or local inefficiency, and reassure viewers that corrective measures are already underway. This framing reinforces the idea that the system itself is sound, and that any failures are exceptions rather than symptoms. One of the most revealing aspects of the session was how the war in Ukraine was discussed, and how it wasn't. The conflict was never framed as a war in the traditional sense. Instead, it remained a special military operation, described in terms of necessity, defense, and historical inevitability. Putin spoke at length about military readiness, weapons production, and Russia's strategic endurance, but avoided any direct discussion of casualties, long-term human cost, or the psychological toll on families. When questions touched on mobilization or soldiers' welfare, the answers were carefully phrased, focusing on benefits, compensation, and honor rather than loss. This avoidance is telling. It suggests a Kremlin acutely aware of war fatigue among the population. By keeping the conversation technical and distant, the leadership seeks to normalize the conflict as a background condition of national life, serious but not emotionally disruptive. The goal is not enthusiasm, but acceptance. Economic questions formed a large portion of the broadcast, particularly around prices, salaries, and regional inequality. Putin highlighted official statistics showing growth in certain sectors and insisted that Russia's economy has adapted to sanctions better than expected. He emphasized import substitution, rising industrial output, and new trade partnerships. Yet noticeably absent was any discussion of consumer choice, quality of goods, or long-term innovation. Economic success was defined in terms of survival and stability, not prosperity or advancement. When citizens raised concerns about rising food prices or housing costs, Putin often responded by referencing future plans or instructing regional officials to look into the issue. These moments reinforced the image of a leader intervening personally to fix local problems, but they also highlighted a deeper reality. Many of these issues are persistent, structural, and far beyond the reach of a single directive. The repeated reliance on promises rather than solutions revealed the limits of centralized control. Social issues were handled with particular care. Questions about healthcare, education, and pensions were answered with reassurances about funding and reform. Putin stressed demographic policies, support for families, and traditional values, presenting them as pillars of national strength. Yet there was little discussion of declining rural services, brain drain, or the quality gap between major cities and the rest of the country. The Russia presented on screen was cohesive and unified, even as lived reality remains fragmented. One subtle but significant pattern emerged in how Putin addressed responsibility. Problems were almost never framed as failures of federal policy. Instead, blame was shifted downward, to regional authorities, bureaucratic inefficiency, or external forces. This preserves the image of the presidency as a corrective force rather than a source of problems. It also reinforces a political culture where accountability is diffuse, and solutions depend on personal intervention rather than institutional reform. There were moments, however, when the script cracked slightly. At times, Putin appeared irritated by certain questions, especially those that hinted at deeper dissatisfaction. His body language shifted, answers became shorter, and the language more defensive. These flashes of irritation were brief, but revealing. They suggested a leadership increasingly sensitive to how questions are framed, and perhaps less confident that public patience is unlimited. Foreign policy, aside from Ukraine, was presented as a story of strength and inevitability. Putin spoke confidently about Russia's role in a multipolar world, partnerships with non-Western countries, and resistance to what he described as Western dominance. This narrative serves a dual purpose. It reframes isolation as independence and casts economic hardship as the price of sovereignty. For domestic audiences, it offers meaning to sacrifice, even if that sacrifice is unevenly distributed. What was most striking overall was the emotional distance of the broadcast. The session was long, detailed, and densely packed with information, yet largely devoid of empathy. Ordinary Russians appeared mainly as data points or examples, not as individuals with complex lives. This reflects a governance style focused on management rather than connection, on stability rather than inspiration. The carefully avoided topics speak volumes. There was no serious discussion of political opposition, media freedom, or dissent. Corruption was mentioned only in vague terms, never linked to high-level figures. Emigration, particularly among young professionals, was ignored. These silences suggest areas of vulnerability the Kremlin prefers not to spotlight, especially in a format meant to project confidence. Ultimately, this year's Direct Line was less about answering questions and more about reinforcing a narrative. Russia is under pressure, but in control, facing hardship, but united, constrained, but sovereign. It was a message aimed not at energizing the public, but at steadying it, encouraging endurance rather than expectation. For ordinary Russians watching, the broadcast likely produced mixed reactions. Some may have found reassurance in the familiar tone and promises of stability. Others may have noticed the growing gap between official language and everyday experience. The event's length and detail conveyed seriousness, but also highlighted how much effort is required to maintain the appearance of normalcy. In the end, the most revealing moments were not the big promises or polished answers, but the careful omissions and subtle defensiveness. They point to a leadership focused on managing decline rather than imagining transformation, on controlling narrative rather than opening dialogue. Where the Kremlin wants the country to go next is clear: forward, steadily, without sudden change, and without too many questions. What that signals about Russia's reality is more complex: a nation being asked not to dream, but to endure.